Monday evening with Richard and Julie, and our house epidemiologist, Raywat Deonandan, is from the University of Ottawa, and he's been joining us throughout the pandemic, and he joins us now to start off the week. Good evening. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm well. How are you?
We're doing as well as can be expected, considering this is the first day of the gradual reopening of Manitoba's society, and that is also the case in some other provinces. But I don't think you're getting too many rules relaxed in Ontario.
And we're in a pandemic.
Well, I'm stuck at home still, so be thankful.
I haven't been anywhere. I've been at home. I've spent 9 hours in my bedroom, and Richard is at the radio station. But are we starting to learn more about what the next steps will look like in terms of, for example, contact tracing? That seems to be the next big buzzword in all of this.
Yeah, so the another way of thinking about our ability to deploy public health infrastructure is the term TTI. T for testing, T for tracing, and I for isolation. We all know about the need for testing. We don't know you have the disease unless you get tested, and as we deploy more testing tools, we'll be able to identify outbreaks as they happen, hopefully in real time. But once we identify someone, we have to trace who they've been in contact with in order to know who to test next. That's the best way to prevent an outbreak from becoming an epidemic. And contact tracing is an art and a science unto itself, but it's not a high technology, high intensity kind of thing. It just needs a lot of people and a lot of resources. It's essentially detective work. So what we need to do across the country is to hire, essentially, detectives to track down tracers. Iceland, for example, has been using actual criminal detectives to do contact tracing throughout this. So they're pretty good at it. And I know that Doug Ford recently announced that he would like to see a national strategy for contact tracing. I think that's a good idea. And the reason for that is if you find a couple of cases in your province and need to contact trace everyone they've been in contact with over the past couple of weeks, if they've been traveling outside the province, you need to be able to cross those provincial boundaries legally and through data. And that requires, some administrative tools, including data sharing across the country. So we're into this new time, this new realm of administrative competence that needs to be unfolded if contact tracing is going to be one of the three important tools that allows normalcy to resume.
Would epidemiologists like to see the use of, for example, apps that keep track of our whereabouts, or is this a case where privacy gets trumped by public safety, public health?
I think we're into that realm now. So in China, during the end of their epidemic, the WHO had to hire about 2,000 teams of 5 epidemiologists each to do contact tracing. We don't have that kind of capacity in Canada. And the way to sort of fill that gap is through technology. There are a lot of apps out there. I like the one in Australia that allows you to figure out if you tested positive, it keeps track of everyone you've come in contact with over the past week or so through Bluetooth to figure out where they are, and automatically public health is informed so they can go and knock on a door and do testing. I understand the privacy implications are enormous, and this is where now all of society has to get involved, the lawyers, the ethicists, the civil rights people, to find common ground over how to balance the need for public safety against the need for privacy. So we talked last time on the show about how Google and Apple are collaborating to produce a new app, and they're pretty cognizant of the privacy issues. So one way to get around the privacy issues is to store the data on the phone until you are tested positive, and then public health will ask you to release your data. Up until that point, you can't be surveilled. So there are going to be some interesting legal and ethical dances to make this happen, but I don't see any way around this other than to give up a little bit of our civil liberties to get a little more of our economic liberties back.
With Raywat Deonandan on 680 CJOB, Richard and Julie with you. Let's throw a couple of the theories making the rounds right now. China in a moment, but Sweden and the Swedish approach, that's getting a lot of sharing right now. And the fact is that they have had very few restrictions, have had many cases, especially in nursing homes, and many more more cases than neighboring countries, but a lot of people are now saying, listen, we haven't paid the economic price, or Sweden hasn't, that other nations have. What do you think of the Swedish approach to all this?
There are a lot of moving parts in the Swedish approach. First of all, we are not Sweden. So the ability to import the Swedish approach to us or the U.S. or other kinds of Western nations is limited. Sweden has the ability, they have a homogenous society. It's not particularly diverse. They have intense trust in their government. They have a compliant population, a mature population in the sense that you can rely on them to do what they're told for the most part. And their borders are well managed. It's also a small country with a very good public health system. And that would not compare well to the U.S., for example. So those factors alone make it difficult to import their strategy here. Having said all that, they're not that different from us in what they're doing. They're still socially distancing. The restaurants are tables very much far apart. Gatherings of more than 20 people, I think, are banned. So a lot of things are kind of the way we're doing them. The difference is that they're not enforcing it through law. And so people are free to be a little more flagrant with the rules on the fringes. Increasingly, though, they're being cited for things like if people are found standing up in a bar, they get a fine when they sit down, I think. However, we may get to the Swedish point at some point. As our economies open up, we're going to have to adopt many of the things that Sweden has done, like enforced continued social distancing as we continue on with our lives. Right? That's going to be unavoidable. The data is not in yet. We don't know if Sweden did the right thing or not. It may end up that a couple of years from now we don't have a vaccine and we wish we did the Swedish way, or maybe we have a treatment and a vaccine by the end of this year and suddenly the Swedes look foolish. So nobody knows what's going to happen. So I don't like the idea of criticizing one approach over the other because we don't know yet. And in terms of economic impact, the Swedes are experiencing an economic downturn as well. Also, don't forget that if we were to let this disease run rampant, that would have been economically torturous and devastating as well. There is no perfect way out of this. I think we're doing a fairly good job. I think most of the provinces will be out of this lockdown scenario within the next 2 to 4 months. And then we will have an openish economy, much like Sweden, but we'll have a much lower caseload and a much lower death rate. So we will have avoided the suffering that Sweden has experienced, while at the same time experiencing, I hope, many of the same economic benefits. So that's my way of not really answering the question, but there it is.
Good context, though. The United States, we're seeing, modeling now that projects more than 134,000 deaths in the United States by early August, nearly double the last projection. You have a president that is now musing aloud that this was leaked and started in a lab, and it's right out of a novel. And now you have our politicians and our senior leaders in Ottawa being asked about this as opposed to starting in a market. Again, context here, because you don't know. We're asking your opinion, but what does the best information tell us at this point?
The best thing, there's something in statistics and science called the null hypothesis, which is the base assumption, the paradigm of current belief. And it takes special evidence to get us to budge from the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis here is that this virus is natural. There's no reason yet to think otherwise. I have not seen the extraordinary evidence needed to have me think otherwise. So it makes perfect sense that it came from a bat population that maybe got amplified through other species in the Chinese wet market. That's a perfectly conceivable and foreseeable and logical framework for how this arose. That it came out of a lab is an extraordinary circumstance for which we'd have to have some extraordinary evidence. So I don't think that evidence is there yet. In fact, the U.S. Intelligence agencies issued a press release saying they believe right now that the consensus is this is a natural thing, a non-laboratory-derived thing. But who knows? Right? Who knows? With new evidence, new conclusions will come out of this. The important question is, what does that mean for our ability to devise treatments? So the assumption that the conspiracy theorists keep proposing is that because it was man-made, there's already a cure somewhere. I don't think that logically follows. So unless this leads us to an actual therapy or treatment or vaccine or another way out, it's a kind of pointless discussion to have, in my opinion.
as we go forward, we're learning more about those potential therapies and work on vaccines. And you hear everything from, we'll have one in a couple of weeks to it's going to be 2 years. How do we really know how to parse that down and figure out what's reasonable?
That's a good question. And the rate-limiting step, as we say, is the clinical trial. So even if we invent something that magically works tomorrow, it won't be in the hands of the public for a number of months. And the reason for that is it takes a number of months to run the safety trials, then the efficacy trials, then to manufacture and distribute on scale. So we can't get by those 3, 4, 5, 6 months and beyond of processing. So right now, for example, I was reading about a new monoclonal antibody therapy, which to my mind is quite promising. What that means is you take a bunch of genetically modified mice and you derive an antibody that they produce that we can then spin up in a lab, and that antibody now can be injected into humans to provide passive immunity or even a treatment or a cure for infected people. It looks very promising in my mind, but it will take time to do the safety trials and the efficacy trials and then to manufacture and distribute. So we cannot get around the fact that this will take at least months before a viable treatment is actively being used in many hospitals. There's another therapy out there that is showing great promise, and that's convalescent serum. It's an ancient technique. It goes back 100 years or so. When you take the plasma of a recovered person and you spin it down to get its antibodies and just inject that into another person, it provides what we call passive immunity. So you're filled with the antibodies of another person, and that prevents infection for you. It can also be used to treat a highly infected individual who's having a hard time. So that's being used already in many hospitals on technically a trial basis, but at a scale large enough that it's considered to be a bit of a treatment. The Red Cross is involved in collecting blood to provide that therapy. But the problem there is that therapy doesn't lead to long-term immunity, maybe weeks, maybe months, but it can be used maybe for healthcare workers to help them on the front lines. To answer your question broadly, though, we are limited by the time it takes to run a clinical trial. There is a proposal by Harvard's Mark Lipsitch to do what's called a challenge trial. That shortens the time of development for a vaccine. It sort of precludes the need for what we call a phase 3 clinical trial. It involves getting a bunch of healthy volunteers, paying them a lot of money, and saying, you're going to take the risk of death to be injected by this vaccine right now, and if you don't die, then we'll know in a few weeks if it's works or not. That's an enormous ethical step to take. And so Mark Lipsitz's paper is essentially putting forth this idea that maybe in this time of emergency, we need to have these extraordinary steps that allow us to preclude the normal ethical framework. It's an academic task right now, but if that's the kind of thinking that gets us out of this, then so be it. But again, we're in this for a while. However, there's a lot of good news, and the good news that I see in the data is that across Canada, the numbers are going down dramatically. There is this indicator we call the reproductive number. That's the number of new infections that one infected person can produce. We like to get that number below 1. It's now below 1 almost everywhere in the country, except for Quebec and I think Saskatchewan as well. So that means that the epidemic is dying out everywhere in the country. That's great news.
Raywat Deonandan, as always, we thank you for your time. We'll talk again.